Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's good to see so many of you here for day 2 of the CCG business stream. We've got another action-packed programme for you for today, so if you're staying for the duration, you're very, very welcome. If you're just here for this session, equally, you're very welcome. My name's Julie Wood. I'm the Director of NHS Clinical Commissioners, who, for those who don't know what we are or who we are, we're the partnership of the NHS Alliance, the NAPC and the NHS Confederation, coalescing our interests in clinical commissioning to be the independent collective voice of CCGs and CCG's membership organisations. So it's a great pleasure and privilege to be chairing this session. Today is about the CCG business stream. So we've got a whole range of presentations and inputs from various people who are all involved in making CCGs and supporting CCGs to deliver on their business, which is clearly to improve the healthcare outcomes for the population that they commission for. Before I kick us into the first session, it'd be really good to know who we've got in the room. I'm just can sort of see. So can I just check, how many CCG people have we got in the room? Oh, good. Great. CSU people? Okay. Others, healthcare providers? Media? Others? Brilliant. Okay, excellent. That's really helpful. Thanks very much. So we need to keep to time, so we will really run this session quite tightly. And we are having the voting response bits happening throughout this session. So I'm not Chris Tarrant, but Bruce will be, and we'll be getting you to vote at various points during his presentation. Bit of housekeeping, please can we ensure that mobile phones are off or on silent? I'll let you know if we've got any changes to the programme that you're expecting as we go through. Feedback forms should be on your chairs. Please do fill them in, because that's the only way we know whether the sessions have been good for you or not. If you haven't had your badge scanned for CPD purposes, please do, because then you get accredited for it. And there's tea and coffee throughout the day from the selected catering points. So that's all we need to do in terms of housekeeping. So without further ado, we'll go on to the first session, and great pleasure to welcome Dr. Bruce Websdale, who is GP advisor to the South London Commissioning Support Unit. And Bruce has got a really critical role in CSU, because it's to basically enhance clinical communication between the CSU and its client CCGs. And in the early days of the new system, fundamental that happens, and that happens well. So Bruce is going to talk about commissioning support, getting it right. So no pressure there, as we're only into the beginning or middle of June, so whether you've got it right. But without further ado, I'll hand over to Bruce. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you very much, Julie. Hope you can all hear. We're at the back. I'm delighted to be here. Good morning to everybody, to Excel. As Julie was saying, Bruce Websdale, a GP advisor to the South London CSU, and here to talk about commissioning support, getting it right, or as I've put it, GIR, because there seems to be so many acronyms around. So GIR, having said that, as Julie just said, I won't have all the answers by any means. I've been in the role for about 5 months. And still learning an awful lot. So my background is really as a part-time GP in Wandsworth, becoming more part-time, I'm afraid to say. And I've worked as a medical director for a variety of organisations, including I was medical director for a period at the Department of Health when we were going through the ISTC programme, so quite a bit of experience about procurement in particular. Since joining the CSU, my main remit has been to engage with the GP colleagues in the CCGs, the GP chairs, to try and understand the challenges that they face and what we can do to better support them as individuals and as professionals. I think it's been a very positive experience from my perspective so far, but I do know that they do face challenges in terms of sustaining their medical leadership against the practice pressures that they're also under. And I think I can honestly say that it has been, so far, an amazing journey. I've really enjoyed the fantastic opportunity to learn more about commissioning, and in particular the challenges of commissioning support. So I'm here to share some of my early thoughts. And obviously these are early days for the CSUs, and so the picture will be changing over a period of time, and I think things are changing quite rapidly. So what I want to do also is make this interactive, so I do want to try and hear what your opinions are. So I will be asking some questions, and those who are from CCGs, I think the CCGs are the ones who desire to answer the questions. The CSUs, I think, probably have to have a think about that. See what the questions are and see if you think it's relevant to answer. So moving on, if I press the button. I don't want to just talk really about South London and my understanding of where the CSU has come from. I've not been there from the inception, so I've got this as an anecdotal story from those who were there in the early days. I believe once the mandate was set for CCGs and CSUs, a task force of senior managers was set aside to look at the structures and processes that were required to try and fulfill the objectives that were set out for support for the commissioning groups. The kind of outcome-based specification has meant that this is probably happening all across the country, and so we have an interesting variety of different types of CSUs. They're all structured in slightly different ways. So the journey began. I think that my team put together this slide, which shows somebody running up a hill. That may be relevant, I'm not entirely sure. I think at times it may feel like that. We're working with PCTs and the CCGs as they too were evolving their own direction of travel, so that became quite challenging. The CSU in London had some setbacks at the first checkpoints, which meant that we had to strengthen the team, mainly about customer engagement. So we went into a customer engagement process, looked at some co-design workshops, and these were set as objectives that were obviously quite positive, but I think other conflicting priorities with the CCGs meant that engagement was possibly a little bit reduced towards the end. So we have a little bit of vagueness around the details of the specifications on services, and I think that's one thing that I'll reflect on a little bit later in the presentation. The problem about CSUs, as you probably know, and CCGs, is that once you know one CCG, you only know one CCG, so that does actually apply. They're all quite different. So we've pressed on with our journey and now have managed to get ourselves with a mission statement. We have 13, I think just recently 14 CCG customers, covering about 3.75 million patients across South London and across Surrey. We have 400 staff working in 2 central offices across South London and with a number of staff co-located with the CCGs. And we're one of the top performing CSUs in the country at the moment, so I'm told. So we believe we've got a sustainable future, and we have to also just consider with one eye on the implications of externalization. And I think that Bob Ricketts yesterday laid out some interesting plans for the future. Obviously we're looking to try and see what the impact of that will be. But we're committed firstly about getting our core services right, but we also have to think about moving on from those transactional type services and trying to understand how we move more towards some transformation. One of the areas that we're working on at the moment is something called COBIC, which basically means something around outcome-based contracts, so that we're looking to try and see how we make the commissioning process a little bit more challenging and interesting. And we're building our own internal ethos. I think one of the things about making sure that our CSU is fit for purpose into the future to provide a sustainable service to its clients is about creating values within the organization itself. So we're making sure that we've got a set of core values, and you'll see there that we're talking about customer focused, a great place to work, responsive, local, good value, and always striving to be better. And I think these are slight challenges around the way in which the relationship exists between CSUs and CCGs, and I'll mention a bit more about that later on. So what am I going to consider today? Looking at getting the best from commissioning support. I hope it's not too simplistic for you. Maybe some information here that will be of help to you, going back to reflect as CCGs on that relationship element with the CSUs. What I'm looking at in particular is understanding what commissioning support means, the CCG and the CSU relationships and responsibilities, some grey areas, which are the more challenging areas about support, and then finally summarising in some way how we can add value to the informed commissioning support customer. So I picked up this diagram in an NHS Net website. I just thought it looked quite busy, and I thought it would represent some of the basic services that are likely to be commissioned and managed by the CCGs. I think you have to realise across all of this has layered a lot more complexity, so this is only really the starting point. And the complexities on top of this are things such as the role of the commissioning board, the role of the Let-Bs, the role of the AHSNs and so on. And I've been out there trying to understand how all of these actually fit together and what support they provide into the process. So it may look a little bit more like this picture, which I'm also managed to find on the same website. And I think the key thing here, of course, is that we are trying to understand how we explain to the public that what's going on is making a difference. So understanding commissioning support. Really here we're looking at what is internal versus external, and Bob was describing yesterday that a lot of CCGs have actually looked to try and keep some of the services in-house. Some CCGs have looked to externalise quite a lot of their services. This does mean, in a way, that we've got quite a different perspective and a great variation between different CCGs. So I think that in particular, the elements we need to look at is how that impacts upon the services that we are providing. Because of course CCGs do need to balance the cost and benefits they get from their support. But ultimately, I think that we must understand that the support function has to make sure that we're giving the CCG leadership and the expertise the headroom to be able to provide their commissioning expertise to change the way in which the services are being delivered. And that's both in commissioning and in their contract management. So we're there to be supportive, but not necessarily authorised. So we have to be careful about overstepping particular lines of responsibility. We ultimately want to make sure that we have a support function that empowers but does not replace clinical commissioning process in all of its aspects. We have a local versus sector element as well to understand. There are needs in the local health economy and benefits from having that locality feel about it. But then we need to look at the benefits, of course, of economies of scale because of the size of some of the CCGs. Some back office functions are easy to understand, and those are obviously the first things that have been looked at for the commissioning support function. But local services do differ. When we move into areas such as quality, then we find ourselves under the arguments of, well, we do it a little bit differently here. We feel we might lose control if we hand it over to the CSU. And so I think the CSUs do need to respond to that challenge to provide their proof and evidence for their value for money in those areas. But it needs to be a wider range of support that's provided, because not only do we need to show efficiencies and savings, we also need to show how we can improve services. And finally, that the discussion that is always on everyone's lips, I think, around changing from transactional to transformational. So really, again, trying to look at how we move on from basic back office function. The transformational side of things is much more challenging, like to be more costly, more intensive, and possibly a different concept to some of the back office functions that are provided at the moment. And that's a challenge for the commissioners and for the support units to try and overcome. So to the first of my questions, I hope that the CCGs can actually have a look at this question and give me their honest answers. So the question there is, since the beginning of the CCGs and the transition in April, have you looked for more function or have you looked for less? So there's an A, B, and a C, and a D. Could you please find your controls and give me an answer there? And I'm told if I press this button, if you've all finished, we'll get an answer. Oh. Ah, very interesting. Excellent. Okay, there's a few more questions. Thanks very much for that. Let's move on. So moving on to the relationship aspects. I think this is something that historically we understand is evolving. I think there's some history around who went where from the PCTs and so on, but ultimately we need to understand that there's a collective role and responsibility within the CSUs and the CCGs for the responsibility of providing the services for patients. So perhaps that forced arrangement, CCGs having to use CSUs to get their authorization underway, excuse me, there's a bit like a forced marriage. It's probably ended up with a little bit of disharmony. Or is this just the early stages of a naturally quite tricky relationship, and perhaps even the uncertainty around the future of the CSUs themselves are affecting this ability to have a collective approach to the problems. But I hope that more mature and professional working practices are going to develop, I think, as time moves forward. Of course, at the end of the day, we have to understand that the failure of the CCGs ultimately will mean that the CSUs have failed in their support function too. So there's a collective feel for that responsibility. So understanding each other, do we really understand the details of the cultures and values of the two sides now? There's some suspicion, I think, between the organisations perhaps. Do CSUs properly understand the individual requirements of their CCGs? Sustained and personal trust and working relationships has certainly been given to me as one of the most important aspects within the relationship between CSUs and CCGs. But we risk there having body shopping process where perhaps the CCGs are asking, who do I have for my particular role, and not really looking more at what is an outcome-based specification. So knowing the priorities, do we know really what does keep the GP chairs and the AOs awake at night time for individual CCGs? It's quite varied, and we have to understand that variation. And I think agree the rules of engagement. So sometimes we sense in the CSU that there is a servant and master role, that things are fine when things are okay, but suddenly there can be a bit of pressure placed on that, and the language isn't perhaps the best that can be used to promote the good relationship. So we also need to know priorities for the CCGs. Do we think that their priorities are the outcome frameworks? Would we need to support them more? I think it's a complicated process to get ourselves orientated towards how the outcome framework is going to be measured. If you're performance managing an acute trust, how does that impact upon some of the performance measures that sit at the higher level for your outcome measures for the CCG? And of course, in some ways, poor performance will reflect back onto the CSU support function. Agreeing the rules of engagement, this was really just about making sure that we're not overstepping the mark or treading on toes. I think there are some sensitivities between the two organisations, making sure that people are working in a professional manner. And again, perhaps avoiding a little bit of a servant and master arrangement. And matching CCG and CSU resource, I think it's important to try and get the very best that we can. We need to understand where the strengths and weaknesses are between teams, develop teams, in fact, with shared objectives and clear responsibilities for each side. I think that would make quite a difference. So on that basis, I'm going to move on to another question. Do you feel you have a good relationship with your CSU? And there's 5 answers here. Yes, 50-50, no, and no. Good answer now, that'd be really helpful. And I shall assume that we can move on. 61 in the middle. Okay, very good, thanks. So the next area I'm going to talk about is the grey area. As I say, it's not the colour of my hair, but this is all about really where some of the transition happens between the function and accountability of the CCGs and the back office functions at the moment that seem to be focused upon perhaps by some of the CSUs. And we need to make sure that we're quite clear about where the challenging areas of the grey partition actually lies and what we can do to perhaps see how we evaluate what appropriate support can be provided. So rules on accountability, of course we understand that at this point in time it's quite clear where accountability sits, but sometimes in some of the meetings I've been to you can certainly see that those lines tend to move a little bit, and being quite clear is important. In the CQRG meetings that I've attended, we need to make sure that we're supporting them and not ending up running them. I've been asked by CCG's GP leads to attend some of the non-host CQRGs, and that gives me an interesting opportunity to look across different forums. But again, we need to be very careful about that function. Is it better for someone to be there than for no one to be there at all? Because sometimes the GPs are a bit pushed for resourcing up some of these non-core meetings. And if you've got a 20% activity in another acute trust, do you send across the same number of GPs as you would do for managing your main host trust? Well, the CSU perhaps can be representing, but it cannot be representative of the CCGs, and sometimes that line needs to be quite clear. Clinical versus non-clinical, the adage has always been, no, there aren't any clinicians in the CSUs, they're all in the CCGs. I've found that interesting. I found it interesting that in particular GP leads often can't make half the meetings. I wonder how many GPs are able to come out and visit these shows. Most of them are challenged with their own practice side of things, colleagues I'm speaking to. And so the question is, if they can't make it, if they're challenged in that sense, do we as a CSU look to provide some representation, being better than nothing, and how do we communicate that information out? And there are some non-accountable clinical roles, and one of the areas that I'm pursuing at the moment with my clinical colleagues is about clinical audit, for example. Do we feel that this is an area where, in particular, it could be possible for the CSU to provide some manpower and to make sure that the actual CCGs actually lead on that process, but getting GPs out of their surgeries to go and do an audit on emergency admissions to hospital perhaps is more difficult than it seems, and therefore may put off that opportunity. If we had a backfill service, perhaps that would be helpful. The quality and safety agenda, again, this is the grey area because a lot of CCGs, quite understandably, want to hang on to that area. That's a very important and accountable responsibility. With the added pressures of the Francis report, those all add up to quite a bit of a time pressure on the quality and safety agenda. But I really believe that there is a great advantage from my role, having been to quite a few different quality and safety meetings, the CQRGs, to see the difference of variation and try and look at standardization. I think hopefully that will be beneficial. So there's potential, I think, there for the CSUs to support and enhance the efficiencies and effectiveness and share best practice, share experience, share issues, and possibly share some of the solutions. But that's a bit of reluctance there, but I think a bit more close working with the CCGs and with ourselves. Perhaps we can work towards things like improving dashboards and the process and making things a little bit more consistent, and that will be to the benefit of patients and safety and quality. And control versus benefits of scale, this has always been a challenge. Yes, locality is very good. It does tend to be what the CCG's process was designed to do, but when can we see where the locality side begins to thwart the potential for the opportunity of benefits from scale? So do CCGs identify those scale opportunities? Do they collectively work together to say, this might be a good way to work? Can we go to the CSU and ask them if there's something that they could do for us as a collective unit? Again, bringing in economies of scale, perhaps in a reverse engineered way. So on the grey areas, your opinion. Would you consider, as a CCG, looking to perhaps some clinical input? Do you struggle sometimes with that clinical input, as I just mentioned, GPs for audit teams, etc.? And I'll move on swiftly on that one if I can. Okay, it's very split. Thank you very much. So moving on now to adding value. This is really my summary slide. I want to just bring together what I felt in my few months at the CSU and engaging with colleagues internally and externally, what I feel we could do to try and add value and become better at the commissioning support process. I think cooperation, co-design, clear service specifications, I think these are important. Just getting it right from the very beginning. We still have examples where people will come back perhaps not quite clear about what the specification means, what its full scope is. I think an example was, does communications package include an intranet offering? These are things that better sit down in the room and have a full discussion. I think there needs to be more engagement, and hopefully with a bit more time now there will be an opportunity to do that. I think we have learnt quite a bit ourselves, and as we know, all sides are evolving quite quickly in their maturity and understanding of what's necessary. How do we identify innovation? How are we looking to try and find in all of the CCGs this wonderful world of innovation that is sitting out there? How does the CSU work with CCGs, look to try and identify what is the opportunities through innovative working? Because the NHS has been littered for years, I think, unfortunately, with great initiatives that sometimes would benefit from scale. How can we help work with the CCGs in doing this? And I think also the wider idea is, of course, that CCGs do work across different boundaries, and sometimes community services, for example, would be something that would be quite consistent as a series of opportunities across the boundaries of CCGs. And demonstrating our worth, I think, a very important point. One of my colleagues agree or disagree with, perhaps, but I think, do we really demonstrate as a CSU the key points that we are bringing as benefits? Do we deliver on a monthly basis some sort of quantification of the benefits we've brought that month, the quality we've delivered? I'm not sure that we can even measure quality properly at the moment from a CSU. Do we really know what the cost savings are? How are we helping our clients? And are the customers quite clear that they have an advantage at accessing these CSU services and appreciate the services being delivered, but have mechanisms where things are not going right? And we need to move on from counting bodies. I think the sense is that the CCGs perhaps sometimes look towards the CSU and say, well, in this offering, how many people will I get? What grade will they be? Where will they sit? What will they do? And we've got examples where really CCGs are just asking the CSUs to supply people. We need to move on from that, perhaps, and try and work out how we look towards an outcome measure and not an input. And expert scale opportunities. I'm moving into an area now where there's a much higher end level of commissioning support that could be provided. But again, these are expensive, and we need to make sure that we're able to provide economies of scale for real transformation. I think in particular we want to move the agenda forward on the transactional, transformational side as well, which is where we need that expertise. And we need to make sure that we are working in service development so patients can recognize the transformation that's being made, because otherwise we risk losing the support of the individuals and the patients and the public for the aspirations of clinical commissioning. And I think if we do that, then we'll all have failed at that point. So that brings me to the end. There's one final question on here. Could you just give me a sense of feel about the CSU in terms of reporting? Are you getting a sense of good, positive feedback on your monthly spend, value for money? And I'll press on if I may. No? Okay, it's very interesting. Thank you very much indeed. I think that really brings to a close what I wanted to say. I hope you found it interesting, perhaps learned something along the way. If you have any comments, there's my email address at the end, or there's a stand for you to come and visit. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of the day, and happy to take some questions.